Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something really profound. We're stepping out of the hard physical sciences and right into the abstract world of consciousness and memory. We're unpacking a fascinating piece of source material titled The Amazing Human Mind. Now, whether you look at the brain as a sheer biological marvel or something deeply spiritual, you have to admit the way we think and remember is absolutely captivating, right? So, we're going to break down exactly how this text navigates both the physical realities and the theological implications of memory. Let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be hitting 5 distinct themes. First, the origins debate. Second, the scale of human memory. Third, the blessing of forgetfulness. Fourth, the moral choice of memory. And finally, the ultimate spiritual memorial. Okay, let's look at the foundation of the author's argument.
Starting us off, Section 1, The Origins Debate, Mechanist versus Thinker.
The source material kicks things off by setting up a pretty sharp conflict about where human consciousness actually comes from. It lays out 2 completely opposing worldviews. On one hand, you have what the author calls the mechanist. This is essentially the secular materialist viewpoint. The text describes this perspective as treating the mind like a physical meat machine, basically the result of a random evolutionary accident where some soundless explosion in a prehistoric ape's brain sparked consciousness. But then, on the flip side, you have the thinker. This represents the creationist worldview, drawing straight from Genesis 1:26. In this view, humanity has a spirit essence and self-awareness, specifically because we were made in a divine likeness. The text strongly argues that our very ability to reflect and evaluate is proof of this spiritual origin, and it challenges the evolutionary model as just, well, inadequate for explaining that level of complexity.
Moving to Section 2, The Scale of Human Memory, a Mathematical Marvel.
You know, the text points out that even major skeptics admit the brain is the most incredibly complex arrangement of matter we know of. And to really illustrate this mathematical marvel, the source presents this wild hypothetical. What if human engineers actually tried to build a computer that matches the memory capacity of just one human brain? Well, the text notes you'd need a machine roughly the size of the Empire State Building, and to power it, you'd need half the electrical output of an entire massive hydroelectric dam. Now compare that to our biological reality. Your brain fits perfectly inside your head, runs on just minimal bioenergy, and yet, over your lifetime, it's estimated you can store 10 times more information than the 90 million volumes sitting in the Library of Congress. That is wild.
And the text really hammers this point home by looking at the price tag. $10 billion. That's the source's estimated cost to construct this hypothetical supercomputer. And the kicker? The author notes that even for $10 billion, it would still just be a clumsy, clunky imitation of the biological brain sitting inside your head right this second.
To further prove just how unmatched human memory is, the text highlights some frankly mind-blowing historical feats. Take Mozart, for example. The guy could hear an entire complex musical score just one time and instantly write it down perfectly from memory. Or look at chess grandmasters who can play 400 games simultaneously. They're navigating a board where just the first 10 moves can result in over 169 octillion different combinations. For sure, the text uses examples like these to conclude that absolutely nothing man-made even comes close to human memory.
Which brings us to Section 3, The Blessing of Forgetfulness, the mind's sorting mechanism.
But, having this immense capacity to remember is really only half the story. The text shifts gears here to talk about how the mind takes all this vast daily information and quietly files it away on the back shelves of the brain. It just waits silently until it's triggered by something like a familiar smell or a childhood song. And this leads to a really compelling question posed by the source. Is forgetfulness actually a blessing? Think about that for a second. We usually get so frustrated when we forget things, but the author argues a profound psychological reality here. If every single thing you ever learned, every tiny detail of every single day, sat right at the very front of your active attention, you would be completely overwhelmed. Literally, it would drive you insane.
To make sense of this, the source uses a great relatable analogy. If a mechanic had to think about every car ever built every time he looked at an engine, he couldn't function. It's so true, right? The text argues that forgetfulness is definitely not a glitch. It's a brilliant, built-in sorting mechanism. It protects us emotionally. By letting the vivid sting of physical pain and past heartaches kind of fade over time, forgetfulness acts as a massive blessing. The author views this as a protective barrier designed specifically by a creator.
That brings us to Section 4, the moral choice of memory, history, and suppression.
Here, the source material introduces a major theological pivot. It argues that because our minds naturally sort and file memories based on what we actively care about, remembering is actually a moral choice. To back this up, it highlights a strict biblical warning found in Psalm 9, which declares that wicked nations that forget God will face divine judgment. The author uses this to reframe memory. It's no longer just a biological function, but a serious spiritual responsibility.
Building directly on that idea, the text defines a concept it calls willful suppression. Drawing from the Apostle Peter's writings, specifically 2 Peter 3:5, the source describes how certain mockers willfully forget historical events. The author frames this as the intentional deleting or ignoring of historical realities. A key example used here is the biblical flood of Noah's day, which the author claims is ignored to protect a specific materialistic worldview. So, according to the source's argument, when people claim there's no evidence for God, it's not actually an intellectual problem. Instead, they see it as a deliberate moral suppression of memory.
And finally, Section 5, the ultimate spiritual memorial. This brings us to the final act of the source material, exploring our ultimate spiritual destination. And the text makes a really bold assertion here. Your memory actually follows you beyond the grave. It references the biblical story in Luke chapter 16 about a rich man who wakes up in torment in the afterlife. The text points out that the very first boundary he hits is a command, "Son, remember." For the author of our source text, this is taken as definitive proof that human memory absolutely outlives the physical brain. Since the source views memory as eternal, it details an active, spiritual strategy for how believers should run their minds, drawing on the writings of the Apostle Paul. The steps are pretty simple but profound. First, purposefully forget the things which are behind. This means intentionally dropping the heavy weight of past failures, and honestly, even past accomplishments. Second, actively press forward toward the spiritual goal. It's all about directing your mind's focus forward, rather than getting stuck looking backward.
To help anchor the human mind in this practice, the source points to what it calls the ultimate visual memorial, established by Jesus Christ. At the Last Supper, Jesus commanded, "This do in remembrance of me." The author emphasizes that this weekly communion supper is a sacred design meant to center human memory right back on the divine. Although, the text does note, with the pretty clear tone of warning, that millions sadly neglect this memorial in favor of, well, trivial weekend recreation.
But the text does offer a highly comforting conclusion to balance that out. It points out that while we humans are incredibly prone to forgetfulness, whether that's just biological sorting or the willful suppression we talked about, God's memory is perfect. Citing Hebrews 6:10, the text points out that God is not unrighteous to forget your work and the love you've shown toward His name. The ultimate comfort presented by the source here is that you are perfectly remembered by your Creator.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought, summarizing the entire explainer. Based on the incredible scale we discussed, the blessing of forgetfulness, and the moral weight of what we choose to retain, the source essentially asks you to make a choice. Will you view your amazing human mind as a random evolutionary accident, or will you see it as a multi-trillion-dollar masterpiece designed to reflect the living God? It's a fascinating question that the source material uses to leave us pondering the true nature of our own consciousness. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking to understand the incredible concepts all around us. Catch you next time.